Do you want to introduce our topic for the day?
Yes, I would love to introduce the topic. I rewatched it before this recording, but I watched it like 2 weeks ago, and I know you watched it like 12 hours ago.
Yeah, just about, yeah.
But I'll give it a shot. Yeah, so the movie is The Jazz Loft According to Eugene Smith. And this was a documentary that came out, I think in like 2016 or something, within like the past 5 years, I want to say. And it was produced largely by WNYC, great public radio station and organization in New York. You know, they're the ones that gave birth to like Freakonomics and a lot of the great stuff that you probably enjoy. So yeah, anyway, this documentary, The Jazz Loft, it was one of those very serendipitous documentaries I stumbled across, which is the best way to find documentaries, just by stumbling across them, I think. And what it's about is it's basically about the life of Eugene Smith, who was one of the legendary black and white photographers of the 20th century. He was photographer for Time magazine. Like the standard population would recognize some of his like really iconic photos of World War II and of Pittsburgh. He did a really interesting residency as like the official photographer of Pittsburgh. I don't know what you call it, but for Time magazine, some like gorgeous. I mean, like if you don't appreciate photography as an art, you will after you look at some of his pictures. It's just really something. And basically, he lived in and was the tenant for this loft in Manhattan that later became known as the Jazz Loft, because it was basically an open space where anyone could come in and jam. And it soon became like a mecca for where jazz in the late 50s and early 60s was sort of developing. Some of the big names in jazz, I'm not sure if it was mentioned in the documentary, but I do know for a fact that Bill Evans hung out there a lot. Who, you know, we've talked about him on the show. Legendary jazz pianist who was classically trained, which I always think is, and not just classically trained, like an actual classical pianist that went the jazz route and stuff, which I always thought was very apparent in his playing and just super interesting. But yeah, anyway, it was a spot where jam sessions would happen every day of the week till like 4 a.m. A lot of the big names in jazz hung out there. Bernstein would hang out there from time to time. It became known as like this underground, I mean, it was a loft above the apartment, but it was an underground sort of place. The thing, though, is that Eugene Smith, being such a great photographer he was and a great documenter he was, he took countless photos of everything happening there, everyone that came and stuff. And he also rigged up the apartment with microphones and recording equipment. So when the jam sessions were happening, he would turn it on. And it's a very cool, like, documented case of, like, the jam session, you know, which I don't think we get enough of. Like, I always love any of the B-rolls you can hear or find of like the Beatles recording sessions when they're making Sgt. Pepper, and some of those are even on the anthology series, some like the alternate takes and them chatting about it. So I always think those behind the scenes recording session reels are so fascinating, and that's what this documentary is about. It's about this cool iconic loft, everything that happened there, and also the life of Eugene Smith, who was, you know, we can get to this maybe eventually, but I always thought there's a very interesting time between jazz and classical music and photography. When you think, even just music in general, when you think of like your favorite bands or your favorite artists like Freddie Mercury, you think of the iconic photo of Freddie Mercury at Wembley Stadium, right? How photographers have documented the happenings of music, I think, is such an interesting space. And like the iconic photos of Miles Davis, or that one of Leonard Bernstein lighting that cigarette with his shirt off, like backstage, and things. So I thought that was a really cool thing to explore and tie in as well that the documentary addressed. So that's basically my take to try to just recap it real quick. What are your thoughts, Sridhar?
I watched this. Yeah, it's probably been about 12, 13 hours since I finished it. It was a late night, and I absolutely loved it. And the first thing that I'll add to that is that the documentary just looks so good, largely because it's made up almost entirely of pictures by Eugene Smith. When it's not showing people who are being interviewed, it's basically showing pictures by Eugene Smith.
Yeah.
So, you know, it just on that front, the documentary it just gets upgraded to a level that most documentaries don't get upgraded to, right? Because it looks damn good the whole way through. And yeah, it was actually more about Eugene Smith than I had anticipated. I thought it was going to be mostly about the Jazz Loft. And it really was a lot about it. But I didn't expect to learn so much about Eugene Smith in the process. And that also was really a pleasant surprise, because he just was such an interesting character, almost a tragic character.
Yeah,
right? Or
yeah.
not almost. He was a tragic character. I have a bunch of notes here. Let me just sort of. Yeah,
I don't. So great.
Yeah, I always take notes. You know, the documentary is good because I started off taking a lot of notes and then I eventually stopped because I just was enjoying myself.
That's so true. Yep.
Yeah, I loved this the sense that there was a line early on that Eugene Smith called that window from the loft his proscenium arch, and I totally love that he just was this almost reclusive character who's hanging out and taking all these pictures from the window, you know, of the street, and then the happenings of this of the flower district where they were, and then, you know, eventually it seemed like he moved from taking pictures of the street to taking pictures inside the loft, you know, and I love this sense of he almost made a self-portrait without actually making a self-portrait by documenting his life so thoroughly. Because it sounded like he actually didn't just rig the recording to happen when the jam sessions were, but he just rigged the recordings to go on just during his daily life. Like I remember there were a couple scenes where the phone was just going off and there was like a voice message or whatever. There was like a message left for him or something like that, or like there's someone coming to talk about some random bureaucratic thing or the landlord or something like that, and the tape is just running this whole time. So I found this absolutely fascinating, this obsession with just documenting life, right? And it so happens that both Eugene Smith was obsessive with the way that he took photographs, and also the musicians who would show up at the Jazz Loft were obsessive with making music, right? They were these people are. Their work was their life. So it so happens that this documentation of life also happens to be a documentation of their work. But that seems almost a happy accident, right? The picture that he took when he stood up or something like that. Do you remember that?
Yeah, and he got injured very badly, right?
Pretty badly, yeah. It sounds like there was some attack, and the leader of the troop or whatever, I don't know military terminology, told everyone to like take cover. And Eugene Smith, being the kind of person that he is, when he heard that, he thought there might be a good photograph here. So when everyone else was taking cover, he stood up. And this picture, it's a crazy picture, right? It's because you have to, you know, the thing about taking a photograph is that you actually have to be there when the thing is happening. And
that's when it's like out of focus. You can't even tell what it is, like blurry and fragmented.
Exactly.
And you're like, this is the moment he like got shot like in the arm and in the torso and stuff.
And then it messed up his face. Like it sounds like he didn't have, like, the roof of his mouth was non-existent or something.
One of my favorite quotes about photography is from Ansel Adams, who was good friends with Eugene Smith, and he said there are always two people in every picture: the photographer and the viewer. And because what Eugene Smith was, which made him kind of like perfect unintentionally for this Jazz Loft thing, was that he was just like a trained documenter, which I always thought in a similar vein was the beauty and genius of Ernest Hemingway, right? He was a war journalist. That was how he learned to write, right? In World War One, when he was in Italy and things. So he learned how to like document stuff like correctly, efficiently, and in a way that's interesting, right? In the same way Eugene Smith learned how to do that just via photography and not writing like Hemingway did. But how that influenced Hemingway's style, and, you know, which produces wonderful short stories and of course his novels and things. I think that's also true with Eugene Smith, how he was just trained, whether he knew it or not, just to be like a really brilliant documenter of things. You know, that made him perfect for him running the Jazz Loft.
I think that the term they were using, I had never heard this term before, but they were calling him a photojournalist.
Yeah,
which was very interesting.
I heard that too, and I guess I'd never heard that term as well, and maybe because it's a lost art.
You know, this was before TV, right? So the way that you would tell the stories visually was through photographs. So that's what he did, you know.
The way you saw anything back then was in Newsweek magazine, in Time, right?
Right.
Newspapers to some degree, but newspapers, of course, for better and worse, probably better, you know, had a heavier focus on the written content and stuff. The reason you bought Time was for the visual part of it, So.
Yeah, and to just riff on that for a minute, the sort of documenting of it. Another part that really stuck out to me was when they were describing his process of developing the photos.
Yeah.
So that was so cool and interesting, and it sounds like most people, they would just take the photo and then they would send it off to someone else to develop it, and then they would put it in the magazine and determine the size and all that stuff. But he had this darkroom where he would obsessively develop these photographs exactly the way that he wanted, and the process was using some chemical. I think it was called like ferrocyanide or something.
Yeah, it was some poisonous, beautiful.
Yeah, it was like a
chemical
it was like
that should not be
bleaching
breathing.
agent. Yeah,
yeah, it's probably FDA just like banned it by now.
Yeah, and he would basically color parts of the photos with this ferrocyanide. I forget exactly how the process worked, but to alter the photo slightly. And the two examples I think they gave, they were from the series of photographs that he did on the Spanish village. In one photograph, the glint in the villagers' eyes is exaggerated more than it would in real life, because it's not possible. So the photograph captures a sort of glint in their eyes more than actually happened in the real world. And another one where I think there's a nurse and she's working with the patient, and there's a light in the background, but he uses the ferrocyanide to make the light exaggerated and almost creating a sort of halo effect around the nurse, which is not the light of the lamp, but it's the light of Eugene Smith in the darkroom using ferrocyanide. So this goes to, we talked before about Herzog's sort of ecstatic truth, and sort of fudging things ever so slightly just to sort of give because the nurse is, she is an angel in that photograph, right? And the light didn't quite capture that, so he developed it in such a way as to actually capture that. So it's more true than true, right? There's a similar thing with this Jazz Loft documentary, not the documentary, his documentation of the Jazz Loft.
Right.
It's not purely fly on the wall. There's something there about the effect of the person documenting on the subject, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's also there's that interesting parallel with what we talked about last time or the time before with your recording of your album, how you spliced together several takes, then you create something that's even more magical and more beautiful than anything you actually played, anything that ever actually existed, and you're creating something better than that, right? And the photography is the same way, right? It's like documenting, it's not just documenting just to retell it, no, it's to actually create something, to convey something, to convey an idea, a meaning, and
exactly.
And the idea of even taking a picture in the first place is already artificial, right? Because you're not there, but this is a way to make you understand what it was like to be there, or something along those lines. The art of photography isn't just finding the picture, which, of course, there is an art to that, framing and finding the picture. There's a huge art to that. But the other side of the coin is creating the picture. Yeah,
and I think great photographers understand that almost intuitively. They must.
Yeah.
Right. That the photograph is not merely a document, but it has to be a story.
Yeah. What did he say? What was like? There's that quote they put up on the screen at one point. It was like the key to developing a great film.
I actually wrote it down because I wrote it down because I loved it so much.
And I thought of you right when I saw that. I'm like, all right, I need to recommend this to Sridhar. There it is.
The quote is, "My formula for successful printing remains ordinary chemicals, an ordinary enlarger, music, a bottle of scotch, and stubbornness." So yeah,
isn't that great? Yeah,
yeah, it's super bare bones, nothing fancy, but just sticking it out, and the sort of the sense that he had that it was absolutely necessary to take photographs, right? And or even just to listen to music, to talk about music, and to have. There was a scene later on where the Cuban Missile Crisis is happening.
Right.
And someone comes down to Eugene Smith's apartment, and they're kind of wondering what is going to happen. Like, are they going to be toast in 5 minutes? And what they end up doing is they put on a record, and I think it's of Miles Davis's Spain.
Yeah.
And Eugene Smith is just sort of bantering about how this is all a ripoff of Rodrigo. And I loved it so much. It reminded me of when Martin Luther was asked what he would do if he knew that the world was ending tomorrow. He said that he would plant a tree. And I think that there's something beautiful to that, right? Like, even if you think the world is ending tomorrow, you have to just keep doing the thing that makes life worthwhile in the first place. And you got the sense that if Martin Luther was going to plant a tree, Eugene Smith was going to take a photograph.
Right.
Or at least, or listen to a record, or talk about music in some way. He just, it was absolutely vital for him.
Yeah. Oh, that's so. Yeah. I don't want to get too off topic, but I mean,
I think that ship has sailed.
yeah, long ago. I can also just draw a comparison and think of the great American painter Edward Hopper, who painted probably the most famous American painting of all time, Nighthawks, the one in like the diner with the 3 people and the worker and stuff.
Yeah, it's not even a competition.
Yeah, that's just, and also if you're ever at the Art Institute of Chicago, which I do think is the greatest art museum on this continent, it is
the CIA.
So,
the Chicago,
the
Chicago Institute of Art. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's close. Either that or the National Gallery in DC is also very good. Sorry, Met. You can have your galas and all that nonsense you want to do and pay for your multi-million-dollar renovations and that have
tax the rich.
I mean, the Met has a really great gift shop. I will give the Met that. Yeah, it's actually like the main attraction. Like, the museum, but spend money. But yeah, the Art Institute of Chicago is just phenomenal. Like, that's just a brilliant museum, and that's where Nighthawks actually is, the original actual painting, and it's huge too, or not. I mean, I don't know, not huge, but it's bigger than you think it is. It's like the anti-Mona Lisa. It's actually like a huge thing that you cannot carry.
Yeah.
But I love how Edward Hopper, all of his paintings, all kind of have a common thread, which I think is beautiful. And his theme is always like loneliness and isolation. The other painting I love of his is called like movie theater or something. It's with the woman standing by herself at the side, on the side of the inside of a movie theater. And it's, there's something I just love about that painting. But anyway, I just love how Edward Hopper, when he was painting Nighthawks, the East Coast was very paranoid. I mean, America was a little paranoid with World War II raging in Europe. And the Nazis, having vocalized very clear plans to move their operation to North America.
I'm not sure paranoid is the right word there. I think concerned, like rightfully concerned is...
Yeah, we might want to do something about this. But anyway, so like the East Coast, especially New York, ran blackout drills all the time where they would mask the city in darkness if there's ever a night air raid, with Nazi bombers. So they like practice how to like have like hospitals work in like almost no light. They would practice masking New York in total darkness, so Nazi bombers hopefully couldn't find it. But Edward Hopper just didn't care. He just left his light on and painted all night, every night. And of course, where Edward Hopper lived in Greenwich Village, just, handful of blocks away from where the Jazz Loft was.
Yeah.
Even though Nighthawks was painted maybe 15 years earlier, they're still in the same hood. And I kind of wonder if, like, the bohemian artist nature of New York in those days was, it must have been so cool. Again, there's a name for that effect, right? You always think the generation before you was cooler. You always think it was better back in the 20s, and they thought it was better back in the 1880s and the Victorian era, right?
Yeah.
So I do know that's like there's like a nostalgic syndrome or something, but yeah, I just think with Bernstein running the New York Phil and like Balanchine starting to like get things going with the New York City Ballet and stuff, and like transforming that whole art form, right? And Jerry Robbins was there as well. The artist colony that Greenwich Village was and Midtown Manhattan was, I just think was such a magical time. And it's of course where jazz had already become jazz and was continuing to just constantly develop and become something new and something bigger than itself.
Yeah, it was absolutely a scene in a way that I don't think New York is now. I mean, New York is a hub still. It's still a central node in the network. And it's still one of the most important places on the planet culturally. But it's not the same scene that it was in the 60s, I don't think. I don't get the sense that New York is bubbling over with something new right now.
Just gift shops.
Yeah.
Lots of gift shops.
Lots of gift shops. I'm not sure, which is not to say that nowhere is. There's almost certainly a scene happening somewhere, and I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
It's something that usually you find out after the fact, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's hard to know. I mean, I think one of the crucial elements of this was that none of the people who were there involved in the Jazz Loft were aware that this was a scene while it was happening. They were not self-conscious about it.
I think that's so key. So key. Because I'm sure, I'm just going to venture a guess, but I think, if you would have asked any of them, like, where the art capital of the world, like where the great artistic innovations were happening in the world, they would have said like Paris or something.
Yeah.
Which would not really have been true, right? Yeah. And of course, in the 1920s in Paris, if you asked where the art innovations of the world were happening, which it was happening in Paris in the 20s, but they would have said Vienna.
Yeah.
Right? Right? So I think there is that like time delay, and
there's a bit of a hangover effect.
Yeah. And
like if you ask people right now where they think
exactly.
it's going to be, they would say New York, but it's not. It's somewhere else, and I don't know where.
Yeah. I would. We've talked about this offline a handful of times, and New York's fantastic city, like a music capital in so many ways, a cultural, artistic capital. But as far as the innovations of art, I mean, just look at, again, the Met Gala. Everything you need to know about.
Yeah.
I mean, I always joke, like, the two biggest industries in New York, and I'm pretty sure this is factual. Check me, people, if you think I'm wrong, but there are finance and tourism. Yeah. So, I wonder where the real art scene is right now. But again, I don't think you could possibly know that. Like, it's only apparent afterwards. So,
yeah.
So
I was going to bring this up later, but it's kind of related to this, so I'll bring it up now. I thought one of the things that the movie did really well, and I was really prepared for it not to, is that it didn't romanticize that era. Like you said, there's this effect where you can sort of dip into a nostalgia thinking that everything was cooler back then, and this documentary would have been ripe for that, right? Because this is a pretty cool thing that happened, and yet the movie did a really good job of making, at least to me, two things very clear, which is that one, this was a place of great beauty, but also a place of great tragedy.
Yeah.
The people who were going through here were mostly broke. They had no money, they had no credit, they had barely any food. A lot of them had...
I mean, Eugene Smith was one of them.
Eugene Smith was one of them, yeah. He was always having problems with the landlord and with money. Like his family, he had to leave his house because because of
his marriage was
and he had problems with his kids. And then there was a scene where he kept calling up his kid after his kid had a family of his own, saying that he would threaten to kill himself if he didn't come to see him or something like that. And the son was like, I can't come see you now because I have my own family. I can't ruin my family because of you, and then he would place these expensive he would like send these expensive telegrams to these late night radio shows and ask him to read it out just so I don't know why, but it just seemed like he was tremendously lonely and his life was broken, and the only thing that he had was these photographs and then the loft, like the jazz. And there was a drummer who had gone through there. I think his name was Ron Free, and he had a tragic story of getting hooked on smack and sort of burning out in his mid-20s. Hall Overton is another one. He was there. He played a big role in it, and we can talk more about him later, but he died of cirrhosis quite young. It was a messed up time, and I got the sense that Eugene Smith was just born too early. It's the same tragic sense that I get when I look at Glenn Gould. It's that I just wish that these people were born into the internet, because these are people who need the kind of media that we have now. You look at the pictures of his apartment, and he's just... There was a line in the documentary about how he was just weighted down by all his things. He had thousands of books, tens of thousands of records, and millions of photographs. His whole existence was just weighted down by this thing. And he was like this reclusive, isolated figure who needed connection, but he didn't
Instagram.
Really, yeah, exactly. But he couldn't like quite connect, and I think like the same thing happened with Gould, and I think the internet would have solved a lot of things in terms of being able to, first of all, I mean, can we just take a moment to like thank our blessings for digital content? I mean, Jesus Christ, man.
No, it's funny. I mean, dude, like, so I'm starting to feel old. I think we both are, when like Gen Z is coming up and like they've never not had Netflix or streaming or YouTube, right? So it's easy to, and we talk about this every time we've like critiqued streaming, right? We always do catch ourselves, I think, and we always say like, well, let's at least be thankful we have it, because it's 10 years ago. You always had to like burn a CD for a friend or something. It would be hard. Now I can name any classical recording. I can get it, in a few clicks on my Apple Music app. So
yeah. And this sort of, looking at his apartment, it sort of moved it from the realm of, what would have been inconvenience to a real tragedy. Like, I think he actually was weighted down by all the photographs that he took in a way that he probably would not have been if he could do it digitally, right?
Right.
So there's that, and I'm not sure if this is actually true, but it sounds nice. I think how we're doing something is often much more important than what we're actually doing.
Sure.
So wars will happen, politics changes, but the undercurrent to all this is that I would say the most important thing that's happening is that I'm actually watching this on YouTube. In my home with a laptop that was not, in the scheme of things, that expensive. The
Right.
availability of information and the ease of it and the accessibility of it to more and more people, for cheaper and cheaper. That is the real story of the arc of progress, right?
No, yeah, right. I mean, the great advancements in technology, aren't the new fancy thing, right? No, it's last decade stuff getting cheaper and more accessible, right?
Yeah.
That's how technology actually changes society, right? Like I just love that picture. There's that one of like everyone taking a picture at Grand Central Station in 2006. And yeah, everyone has like the little Canon cameras or your Nikon cameras or something, or your Razr flip phone trying to take a picture, right? It's like a big crowd of everyone doing that. And then they did it again 10 years later, and it's just, a sea of iPhones. Right?
Yeah.
I always joke too, I think the 60s were like my decade. Like I wish I could have been around in the 60s, because I thought, the great films of the 60s, the great, Sinatra, the Beatles, Bossa Nova, the fashion, always, like, look at anything like JFK wore. I mean, it's still stylish today, right? Look at anything Carter or Reagan or Bush wore. It looks hideous by today's standard,
yeah.
Right? But like the fashion of like the 60s lasted in like a really cool way, I think. But then again, like go back to the 60s, talk to anyone who lived through it, especially in New York, right? New York was more corrupt than it had ever been, right? Crime was terrible. It was a dirty city. The EPA hadn't been established, right? It was not a clean place to live. There was, the missile crisis, as you said, international turmoil. The civil rights movement was happening, and the civil rights movement was iconic and great. After the fact, it was like very painful when it was actually going on. It was not an easy time, right? But again, right, you always kind of romanticize it, looking backwards. So yeah, I totally agree. I got that sense too. This documentary was, in the way Eugene Smith would have liked it, it was very raw.
Yeah.
Right. It was very unfiltered and kind of just showed what it was like to like spend your life in this crummy loft apartment that I'm sure would violate any building code.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like that was not safe.
Yeah. If there was a fire, that would have been the end of him.
Forget nukes from Cuba. Just just some idiot with smoking downstairs, which I'm sure there were.
Yeah, it seems like they were doing a lot of stuff. There was a hilarious scene where someone was describing what they were drinking. And
yeah, right.
And this guy, I don't know if he meant it as a joke, but it was hilarious. He was like, "We had this thing. It was called Old Philadelphia, and I'm not sure what it was, but you could do two things with it. You could drink it, or you could thin paint with it." I'm gonna be like, you that's paint thinner. You know exactly what that is. You're drinking paint thinner, bro.
Yeah. So I'm curious, do you have any particularly favorite photographs you remember from it? Because I think you really touched on something great, which is like visually, this is just one of the greatest things I've seen in a while. Which again, partly I guess is credit to the documentary makers. They made the choice to include all these great photographs by Eugene Smith of the loft and the environment and the people there, and Thelonious Monk like jamming on the piano and doing like rehearsals for the piece he was premiering at Carnegie Hall. All the rehearsals were all done at the Jazz Loft. I mean, it's like, so cool. But yeah, I'm just curious, are there any particular photographs you remember that stand out to you? Any favorites?
Oh man, that's a really tough question, mainly because I mean, probably hundreds of photos would have flashed by the screen, right?
I could go first because I watched it like a few weeks ago, so I think the ones that I still remember are the ones that obviously stuck with me.
Yeah.
I love the picture of Salvador Dali hanging out in the Jazz Loft.
Yeah.
Yeah, like smoking a cigarette or something. Like he's like,
yeah,
like achievement unlocked if like Salvador Dali's hanging out at your place.
yeah. In general, there were some interesting non-musicians there. I saw also that Norman Mailer was there. The writer. So
right.
Yeah.
So I love that one. I love the. You just know you're going to like a cool place or a cool party if the sign at the entrance on the ground floor level says, "If you must knock, knock loudly."
Yeah.
I just thought that picture was really funny.
There was another picture of a sign. I don't know if this was in his house that he had to leave or if this was in the loft itself, but there was a sign that said, or maybe it was to the entrance to his darkroom. But he wrote a sign that said something like, "Please do not disturb me unless it's the second coming of Christ. And even if so, please check to make sure that's true." Or something like that.
Nice. I also liked, so when he lived in Pittsburgh for a year on assignment, I love so many of those pictures. The one that just I love for some reason, I don't know why, it was just the one with all the railroad tracks. The big railroad track intersection, I guess.
That one was really cool.
Yeah, just because trains are awesome and cool. But also just, I don't know why, I just thought that picture was just like so mesmerizing.
I'm a sucker for a good geometric photograph or painting. So. That just hits me in all the right spot. I mean, like the album cover for the Quarantine Tapes. When I saw that picture that Libby took, I was like, I was so sold on it from the get-go.
Yeah.
Because like the electrical wires or whatever you call them, the electric lines, the row of houses, I just was like, this just is the power lines. For some reason, my brain just is like, yes, this needs to be it.
Yeah, no, that's so cool.
Some other ones that stick out, again, because I just watched this so recently, there's so many photographs just flicking through my mind that I'm like having a hard time picking some out. But the ones that we mentioned about the Spanish village were really moving. And there was one of a soldier. He has a cigarette dangling in his mouth and he's sort of turning around. It's almost like a portrait of him, and that one was also,
that's a pretty good one.
One of the things is that really interested me about this loft. I'm not sure if we cut it from a previous episode, but you were talking about that quote by someone about how the most beautiful things are like functional, right? Like a bridge or something.
Yeah, that's from the opening line of that Ken Burns documentary on the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
That quote you're referencing is by Montgomery Schuyler, and it is this: "It so happens that the work which is likely to be our most durable monument and to convey some knowledge of us to the most remote posterity is a work of bare utility, not a shrine, not a fortress, not a palace, but a bridge." Boom.
I love that.
I actually read it not badly. Okay.
Yeah, that was a good read, man. That was a good read. Okay. I was impressed. I didn't want to say anything, but since you said it first.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I loved about this loft, that it wasn't this, self-conscious artistic thing. It was a functional space, right? I mean, working musicians are up late. That's just a fact of life. That's what comes from doing a job where you're working when everyone else is hanging out.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So to have a space where you can rehearse, not just jam, but rehearse, work with people, late into sort of 3, 4, 5 a.m. and then sleep during the day. That's an invaluable space for musicians. And I'm not sure if something like that could exist anymore. It seems like because of there was like a lack of regulation happening. And they had some reason about how they could do it because it was like a commercial zone or something like that. But I'm not sure. I don't think that would hold up today.
Right. Yeah, because it was zoned as a commercial district, so there was no noise ordinance. Right. So if it was residential, then, rehearsing until the sun was rising would probably not go over well. But
it might be today that those spaces still exist, but they're in an institution, right? Like we used to rehearse, at 2, 3 a.m. But we had a music school that we could go to, and the key.
Are you about to say what I'm thinking you're about to say?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, you said the key is to get in the building by midnight because they lock the doors at midnight. But if you're in, you're in. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes we did cut it pretty close. We got there like just before midnight.
Yeah.
And then we rehearsed for a few hours.
Or the old classic trick of getting there before midnight and putting a little pebble in the door.
That's right.
And then peacing out and coming back at like 2 a.m.
Yeah.
But
that was the Music Annex building, right?
Yeah.
That was like everyone kind of knew that secret, and you know what? Sometimes you could just like safely assume that someone would do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the custodian's like, yeah, I don't get paid enough to care. So.
Yeah, exactly. There's no way. But the key point of this, one of the central aspects, is that none of these people, with I think the exception of Hall Overton, worked within the parameters of an institution.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
They had essentially nowhere to go. And of course, if you had a house that was sort of a big house and far away from things, then you could also, rehearse there late at night. But another key element to all of this is that all of these people were broke.
Yeah.
So
right, like many of them lived there for like a stretch of time here and there and stuff, and it was.
I think lived is glorifying it a bit. I think they crashed there. Maybe they were put up. Yeah.
Yeah. But like a few of them, I remember them saying had like a few changes of clothes like in the file cabinet because it was zoned to be a commercial district. So, so when the landlord came along, just to make sure, dude, this honestly reminded me a lot of like Maxwell parties back at college.
Yes, we had these. We had parties that were a lot like this. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was the apartment complex, like right a few blocks. It was off campus, but just a few blocks from the music school. But yeah, there were parties, right? Everyone would show up around like 11 or midnight.
Yep.
Like the party wouldn't start until then. And they would go as long as people stayed there.
And we would just sight read music and...
Yeah, just sight read chamber music, hang out. It was just like such a like supportive, I don't want to say that in like a corny environment. Like everyone knew why they were there. It wasn't to one up the other guy. But this was very much the community part of it where you all wanted to just... create something great. Yeah, those are so much fun.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Anthony Bourdain always used to talk about how, like, his favorite part of his life as a chef, before he was a writer and travel TV guy, was after the shift ends to go to hang out with all the other chefs late at night and eat and drink and talk shop, talk about the day of service, and that's what this was. I think that's a vital part for the, there's certain professions like being a chef, being a musician, dancers. There's certain things where you are doing work when everyone else is relaxing.
Yeah.
And that you need to have some sort of community after work for these kinds of jobs, right? The Jazz Loft plays this very functional space, like the Maxwell apartment. I think we would come back after a concert, after playing in the pit or something for the opera.
After the
Nutcracker, baby. But then the real fun of being a musician would begin afterwards, right? The fun of being a musician is to hang out with other musicians and talk shop and talk music.
Yeah, well, and I think that's natural for chefs and musicians, and you said like ballet dancers, because it's a very collaborative art form. Photography, less so, which I think made Eugene Smith like more and more unique and more special, right? That he was that kind of person. When photography, when you think about it, is, again, I'm not a photographer, so but my guess is it is a pretty solo art form, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that it was, even though like the topic of this documentary, it's so music centric, but the fact that the person's place who was at, he was not a musician. I don't know, we probably should have said that, but Eugene Smith was not a musician. He was a brilliant photographer, brilliant human, but he was not a musician, which I think made it perfect.
Yeah.
Right? He was the one audience member for all this. Even when they're interviewing some of these musicians nowadays, they said he was perfect because musicians famously kind of hate photographers, right? Because they're always, okay, now hold your instrument that way. All right, good. All right, now wink at me a tiny bit. Right?
Yeah.
It's like,
hold that pose.
Yeah, exactly. All right, now pretend you're playing something hard. And something, so, but they said with Eugene Smith, in the greatest way possible, they would forget he was even there. I have a hard time believing this Jazz Loft scene could have happened again or anywhere else. Like, it was kind of this, it could have happened differently and it could have been just as great, but different. But the way this scene was really just at the, unique and precise combination of all these different factors that just, I don't think will ever happen again. And again, that's what kind of makes it so cool and interesting and why this documentary was so great.
Yeah. I mean, even little things like it had to be Eugene Smith, not just because he loved music, but the way that he worked was, I think, fairly unique for a photographer. He seemed to be a night owl,
Yeah.
He seemed to be obsessive about developing his photo, like we talked about before. He seemed to be obsessive
Yeah.
about controlling every aspect of the development of the photograph in a way that maybe a lot of photographers are not. And he would go on these sort of obsessive binges of work, right? He would just sort of work for a week or something, and then crash. He needed music while he was developing his photographs at 3 a.m. and the musicians needed a place to rehearse. So here we are.
Right.
This is perfect. If he was another kind of photographer who was like more traditional, he may have easily said, "Shut the fuck up! I'm trying to sleep. I need to go to my job."
Another thing too, right, to add to your list right there, he was extremely obsessive about how his pictures would eventually be presented. Like he got in arguments and fights all the time with the editors of Time magazine over like where on the page this picture would be printed, what the text under it would be about, like on which page it was and things. Not just page 1 is more important than page 2. No, like in what order would you see the pictures if you're going through page by page and things, right? He was obsessive about these things. I have a feeling a lot of photographers wouldn't be, right? Just, all right, give you my check on the way out and I'll keep taking pictures for you.
Yeah. And that's why he ended up at this loft. I think this loft was the kind of place where geniuses kind of filtered to. Geniuses who could not sort of quite fit into their field. I hesitate to use the word misfit, but maybe that's the right word. These people who couldn't quite function in a sort of institutional bureaucratic capacity, right? He had a great gig at, was it Time or Life? I forget.
Time or Life.
Same difference.
Yeah.
But he couldn't quite fit in, so he quit, because of the problems with lack of control in the final product, and he had a hard time making a living because he couldn't quite work well enough as part of a team to sort of get the kind of salary that he's obviously capable of if he could just sort of relinquish a little bit of control and just shut up a little bit. He could obviously have
Right.
made quite a good living, but instead he ended up at this sort of dingy hole in this Manhattan loft, right? And Hall Overton was there, and he had a gig teaching composition at Juilliard, but he had his own problems. He was teaching composition at Juilliard by day, but he was chain smoking, hard drinking. He was doing the whole jazz thing on the side, and he also sort of filtered through the institution into this loft. And Thelonious Monk, who worked with Hall Overton, he had lost his cabaret card, so he couldn't work at the clubs anymore, and he was trying to make his comeback. It was all these people who had essentially no business being at such a down and out place because of their level of talent and genius and success, but they had sort of filtered to this place.
So basically, if Impolite to Listen was an apartment, it would be the Jazz Loft.
Yes. That's exactly what this podcast is. It's a repository for underappreciated geniuses.
Yeah, right. And sure, there's a podcasty element to the Jazz Loft. I mean, he just like turned the mics on and let things happen, which kind of like a podcast. This podcast, actually.
Yeah. I really got the sense that the same kind of feeling that I get with Glenn Gould, where it's just like, oh man, this would have been he would have been so interesting in the media age. Like, you give Eugene Smith the internet, he would have done something totally insane. What would Eugene Smith's podcast be? That would be off the hook.
Yeah. Glenn Gould's a great example too, right? I mean, like, think if Glenn Gould could ever have a computer.
Yeah.
Like, the cool things he could have done. Yeah, like if Eugene Smith were alive, he'd be like amongst the most famous people like on the internet and in the world, right? But again, I always kind of wonder, but maybe that's over romanticizing it. Maybe he would never gotten into photography then, right? It's like photography was something very different back then and had a lure that he was drawn to. And because I always thought the same thing, like what if, the classic thing, like, oh yeah, if Beethoven were alive today, what would he be doing? I'm like, I don't think he'd be composing symphonies.
No, probably not. He'd probably be coming up with the new hot TikTok dance or whatever the kids are doing.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah. So, okay, I'm trying to think. Anything else you want to touch on the Jazz Loft?
Let me check my notes here. I think I've kind of hit all.
I think I hit on. I have one bullet point that says photography and music relationship. So.
Nice, man. You are a scrupulous note taker.
Yeah, that is.
That's what we call doing the work. I think we hit it though.